Hello again everyone and welcome back to the Underground. This is the Ukrainian War Intel update for March 2nd, 2022. Let's get right to it. Much like last time, I don't really have a whole lot for the geopolitical sphere, even though a lot has happened. There's really not a whole lot worth talking about or commenting on. I did want to briefly mention something that I thought was interesting, and that is in Russia. There are extremely unconfirmed reports that Valery Gerasimov was fired by Putin yesterday. But I think these rumors are untrue. Firing the chief of staff for the Russian armed forces during an invasion is something that is not very likely to happen, even if the invasion is going badly. So far, it sounds like these reports are the result of Western leadership trying to cast doubt on Russia's leadership. And this is a trend that has continued over the past few days, because we've heard constantly that Russia is losing, and that Putin has gone insane, or that there has been rioting and mutiny among Russian forces in Belgorod, or that a military coup is brewing in Russia from Russia's invasion failures. None of this is verifiable to any degree, and all of this is probably false. The only way that I can think that Putin would outright fire his version of the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff is if something so egregious occurred that it was worth losing face in the act of firing him, and I highly doubt that that has occurred. Also, in Ukraine, the evacuation issues have become more prevalent as more and more people try to egress to neighboring countries in the west, but we'll talk more about that in a bit. And in Belarus, things are heating up as well, with Belarus approving a referendum to give up their non-nuclear status. So basically what this means is that Belarus could be they could be host to nuclear weapons in the future, meaning that Russia could deploy nuclear weapons to their terrain, or Belarus potentially could even get nuclear weapons of her own. This is something that's pretty big when it comes to European politics, but again, this is just a direct result of Russia and Belarus trying to expand into the rest of Europe. Anytime that word nuclear gets thrown around, people tend to panic a little bit. With this, I wouldn't necessarily view it as anything more significant. I mean, if you just look at geography and how nuclear weapons work, it doesn't really matter if there's a nuclear weapon in Belarus or not, because a nuclear weapon in Belarus versus being launched from Smolensk or Bryansk or something like that, it doesn't really matter too much when it comes to that sort of thing. But this is definitely a political play, which we will talk about in just a bit. Before we go on, I briefly wanted to mention a major warfare tactic that is being used in the information war right now by all sides and all players. And that concept is called gaslighting. Those of you who have been downloading our slides should recognize this from several days ago, but I've only found it prudent to verbally talk about right now. For instance, I pulled all of these graphics from various domestic abuse websites because that's how most people are aware of this psychological warfare tactic. If you take a moment to read these graphics, you might notice a lot of familiarity between these gaslighting tactics and pretty much everything that's been said by various political and social groups around the world over the past few years. Without getting too much into the weeds, we are seeing gaslighting and other similar psychological tactics being the primary weapons of very powerful people around the world, and this is becoming a significant problem for the Ukrainian war. Causing someone to doubt their own sanity and reality is certainly where we are at with regards to most of the events that are being talked about in the world today. Of course, a false tweet is not comparable at all to a Grad strike, but those of us who are located outside of the combat zone and are trying to help people in the combat zone, the information war becomes the primary fight for us. And this is where we come to a standstill ourselves, because right now the misinformation that is out there is so thick that it's not possible to know what's going on with any reliability. For the most part, the theme for this brief is that there's a lot happening, but almost none of it is verifiable due to the blatant lies that are being told by all sides. I go out of the way to make this distinction now because understanding this concept is an important lens with which to view what I'm about to say when we get to each front line. Moving to the overall operating picture, much like last time, the situation on the ground with regards to frontline locations has become more ambiguous. Plus, we also have to remember that Russia is conducting this invasion mostly along surface roads. It's not like when we think of a normal front lines of troops advancing across the countryside. There isn't a whole lot of cross-country travel being used by the Russians, except for tactically in various situations where they need to maneuver off of a hard-packed road, right? So, for the most part, it's not really doing justice to the invasion to kind of put lines on the map, but it's kind of the best way to visualize it, so we're still going to keep doing that. But in any case, forces to the north, northeast, and east have observably slowed down the pace of their advance. This is mostly in the north as Russian forces build up for the fight for Kiev. The Southern Front continues to be the front where most advances have occurred, although much like the rest of the fronts, the pace has slowed down over the past 3 days. There have been reports / rumors of the Russian Ministry of Defense calling up reinforcements by way of more conscripts, and there is some evidence to support this, but it is difficult to determine what fronts are the priority for any reinforcements that arrive in theater or move forward into Ukraine from forward operating bases along the Russian and Belarusian border. In other words, we don't know if Russia is calling up troops from all over the country like they did for this initial invasion, or if they're just moving guys that they had pre-staged along the border this whole time. So it's really unclear, really hard to say which units are moving where. So at this point, our graphics showing each unit is very inaccurate. Speaking of Belarus, Lukashenko has been more vocal than usual lately and very strongly indicating that Belarus will be joining this conflict soon, and it looks like Belarusian forces have already joined the fight in certain areas and probably were part of the initial invasion as well. Belarus doesn't have a super large military, but Lukashenko clearly wants a piece of this action, and since the only reason that he hasn't been Mussolini'd in the streets is because Putin is propping him up, Lukashenko's entire existence is dedicated to currying favor with Putin. So we will see Belarus join this fight. The question that remains unanswered is how much they will bring to the table. As far as IFF markers, nothing really major new. There have been a few new symbols or letters, but it's really hard to tell if they're actually a new letter or if it's an older letter that's either due to combat damage, kind of disfigured, or if somebody painted it wrong or something. It's really hard to tell, but this is really what we're still sticking with as far as IFF markers. On the Northeastern Front, we continue to see Russian forces make very small, limited advances, and there appears to be a split in various forces. And what I mean by that is forces that are west of Kharkiv appear to be dedicated for the fight for Kiev. They were supposed to go further into the countryside, but it looks like Russia has determined that Kiev is going to be a big fight. Which it is, and they are pushing forces that probably were dedicated for other locations to Kiev. Now, forces that are taking Kharkiv, those forces are going to take that city as well. Again, Kharkiv is Ukraine's second largest city, so it's not a small town by any means, so there's going to be a lot of forces dedicated for that. Also, we're seeing that tactic of Russia basically encircling or bypassing cities occurring as well. The town of Sumy has been taken and retaken. It's changed hands a few times, but again, then we fall into the definition of, or fall into the tactic of trying to define what taking a village actually means. Does it mean driving through it? Does that mean you took the village? It's really hard to say. So really what we're seeing is Russia trying to tie down forces in some of these smaller cities like Konotop and Sumy, and then larger forces bypassing these cities to head for their primary objectives, which in this case are Kiev and Kharkiv. We're even seeing forces starting to bypass Kharkiv and head further to the south and east as they try to conduct a pincer operation from Kharkiv all the way down to just off the slide to the Eastern Front and Luhansk regions. So we'll move down there now. On the Eastern Front, it's become clear to us that two major lines of effort have emerged. One, which is a sort of pincer movement, or really just an advance on two different fronts, two opposing fronts for the city of Mariupol. Forces in the occupied territories are trying to push to the west to cut off Mariupol to the north and try to link up with the forces that have advanced from the south, from Crimea, around the city to pincer around it and cut off the city further. Mariupol, for all intents and purposes, is more or less cut off right now from the outside world, although there are pockets, right? It's not like there's an imaginary line stretched around the city, right? So breakout operations are certainly still possible for any Ukrainian forces that wish to egress further back into Ukraine's territory. But it's unclear as to what Ukraine's motives are for Mariupol. It looks like they're going to be trying to take that city, or hold that city, rather, for the foreseeable future. Moving down south, there appear to be three main lines of effort, with one, like I mentioned, being dedicated to supporting Mariupol from the west. Another one appears to be piercing to the north, most likely along the Dnieper River, north to Zhaporizhzhia, and an additional unit that's pushing to the west to take the city of Kherson. As of a few hours ago, we've got the notification that Kherson has been taken, or at least their mayor says so. So Ukrainians are admitting that Russian units have taken Kherson and are actually trying to set up administrative areas already in the city. Further attempts to push west across the Dnieper are really hard to say right now. Most likely Odessa will be assaulted with an amphibious assault very, very soon, if it hasn't occurred already by the time this video gets out, because Odessa is a major port town, and that's going to be a very critical avenue for things like trade, and it's just a very populated city, right? So it's going to be a major target for the Russian advance. Moving to the Western Front, the front which is really the forgotten front because not really much has occurred here, still continues to give us some information, and that is this time to do with Alexander Lukashenko. So yesterday, Belarusian dictator Alexander Lukashenko held a televised meeting with his Security Council to discuss the situation in Ukraine. What caught many people's eye was the map that he was standing in front of, which showed a few interesting things. So let's enhance. If we enhance the image a bit, we can clearly see that someone is planning an attack on Moldova. Maybe. Again, this could all be a deliberate mistake that is made to make us think that Russia and Belarus are going to invade Moldova, specifically Transnistria, next. This map also shows Ukraine being broken up into 4 administrative areas, again hinting at the goal of a total eradication of the Ukrainian state. If this is genuinely Russia's plan, then the situation is far worse than we thought, and Russia's goals are far more ambitious than we thought. But I myself am withholding judgment on this for now. Attacking Transnistria would be a really, really big deal. Even if it is a breakaway republic/Russian puppet state, that would prove without a doubt that Russia's intentions do not lie only within Ukraine. The other interesting part of this map is that it is slightly out of date, and based on the lines of advance, we can clearly see that things are not going as planned for the Russians. So many forces have had to change their plans, and as we can now see, the mad dash for Kiev has begun. So rather than following this map's scheme of advance, every unit along the Northern and Northeastern Front is headed for Kiev. But again, this might be all a trick, who knows? Russia has been known to genuinely accidentally leak very sensitive, top-secret information to the press, such as the stuff that came out a few years ago about the Canyon nuclear torpedo project and other Gucci directorate stuff. Ordinarily, it's a pretty bold move to show a map of your invasion on live TV, but Lukashenko is a pretty bold guy, so it would make sense for him to show this map and boast about his military goals. And if this is a deception operation, I can't imagine what goal that deception operation would have. It seems like there wouldn't be much to gain by leaking this intentionally. As always, we will have to wait and see if these lines of effort materialize, and more importantly, keep a closer eye on the situation in Moldova. On the Northeastern Front, Russian troops have begun stacking up for the assault on Kiev, which should be getting underway in earnest right about now. But the Russian advance has slowed to a crawl, so much so that I would go as far as to say the advance to Kiev has stalled, at least temporarily, as Russia continues to stage troops. Russia has dedicated a lot of forces for the Battle of Kiev, and those forces have been observed in what is now called the 40-mile convoy of vehicles stretching along the main highway south into Kiev. But we will talk about this in a moment. Let's zoom in a little closer. In Kiev, various local TV towers have been struck, resulting in television broadcast outages throughout the area. This is something that, again, we should have expected, honestly, on the first day of this conflict. It should also be noted that Russia has announced that civilians who want to leave Kiev, Kharkiv, and other cities will not be harmed for trying to leave. And at this stage, we here have no reason to doubt that this policy will be honored. Russia may have indiscriminately targeted civilians passively with artillery and airstrikes, but for the most part, Russian ground forces have not been targeting civilians en masse. However, seeing as the Ukrainian resistance will be heavily concentrated in cities, Russia will also begin to conduct strikes in these locations as well. Artillery strikes have already been conducted in some parts of Kiev, and we expect that to continue and increase in severity over the coming days as Russian troops begin to enter the city. It's unlikely that Russian forces will attempt to level the city. It's more like they'll probably be going for just pockets of resistance or military targets within the city. But again, Russia's complete and utter lack of concern for collateral damage means that there's going to be a lot of damage throughout Kiev over the coming days. And that kind of leads us to something that we have been observing and thinking about this invasion since it began. And that is the question of, why is Russia performing so poorly in this fight? And for the entire Western world who is fervently taking notes on this war, this question keeps coming up as well. Why has Russia not had a single notable action during this entire conflict? Yeah, sure, Russia's still invading, and they're not losing, and they're still moving forward and making progress, but it's almost like every goal they have achieved has been almost on accident. There has been fierce fighting in places like Kharkiv, Chernihiv, Chernobyl, Luhansk, Mariupol, and places like that, and Russia has won battles in these areas. But it does not appear that Russia has achieved a clear, decisive, total victory anywhere. Every battle that they have fought has cost them dearly. Even in the skies, Russia doesn't maintain dominance. Every first lieutenant at every army unit that has ever existed wrote a term paper at some point detailing the importance of aerial superiority during an invasion. And even people who have no understanding of warfare doctrine can see that Russia should have achieved total and complete aerial superiority over the entire country of Ukraine within the first few minutes of the invasion. But they weren't able to do that. And even 3 days after the invasion began, they had 2 Il-76s get shot down. And then there's the 40-mile convoy headed to Kiev. Let me tell you, every single military service member who has ever driven a vehicle can look at that satellite imagery and cringe. That is without a doubt the fattest target for an ambush that I have ever seen in my entire life. Remember, these guys are not stacked up like this inside their own country. No, they are miles behind enemy lines in a country which has an active insurgency against them. And this comes after some of their comrades down south got decimated by a Ukrainian drone strike in this exact situation. So all of these thoughts are not to push the Western propaganda that Russia is losing or demoralized. We have no way to know that. This is just a genuine observation that at this point is worth talking about. Anybody who has studied warfare for 5 minutes can plainly see that Russia is making a lot of mistakes. Mistakes that are so serious that it makes you wonder if there's something here we don't know. And that is certainly the case. We're just spectating this like everyone else. However, one mistake that we see being made on the part of Western military strategists is that they are grading Russia's actions using a Western textbook. Russia's style of warfare is different from ours, and there are a lot of things that people tend to forget. Like vehicle spacing. We here in the U.S. are hypersensitive to that due to several decades of fighting insurgencies. Russia's last insurgency-ish fight was in Georgia in 2008, and that wasn't a great learning exercise for Russia with regards to counterinsurgency because they overwhelmingly won that conflict in just a few days. But even going back to the Chechen War, Russia has not had the same experience that the United States has. And Russia's military is certainly not an expeditionary one. Russia's reliance on rail to move the majority of her logistics, and the doctrine of not really stressing truck-based transport at lower and lower echelon levels might be the main reason that Russia is having logistical problems right now. And the logistical stresses of pre-invasion training exercises is something to think about too. Remember, these troops were on the border of Ukraine for a couple of weeks, and just keeping 175,000 troops fed and warm in the field had to have been a logistical nightmare. And that was before the invasion even began. And we know that these logistical woes did exist because we saw a lot of soldiers being sent forward to staging areas along the border without winter gear or with sparse food supplies. For the aviation threat, another way to look at why we haven't really seen the skies full of Russian aircraft is that they know the man-pad threat is real. What's the point of sending in your brand new shiny fighter jets or massive waves of ground attack aircraft against an enemy that's extremely dispersed, dug in, and with a single dude with a shoulder-launched missile on every apartment rooftop? Even though Russia has the capability to send in hundreds of aircraft every hour, if they aren't willing to get a lot of them shot down in the process, do they really have that capability? Same with the armored divisions we've seen rolling around. We think of Russia's actions in terms of total numbers and not the numbers that are actually being observed in practice. Sure, we might see a column of vehicles and armor that is over 40 miles long with hundreds and hundreds of armored vehicles stretching out to take Kiev. But here's the thing. At the very front of that column, you're not fighting all 40 miles of it. You're fighting just the first few vehicles. Again, the warfare doctrine that armies around the world learned the hard way over time is that the surefire way to whittle down an overwhelming force is to take them on one at a time. This concept goes all the way back to the gates of Thermopylae and the story of the 300 Spartans. Canalizing terrain, even self-imposed canalizing terrain in the form of sticking to roads for ease of navigation, is something that the Russians don't appear to be too concerned with. And with a civilian populace in full-on guerrilla warfare mode, this is a decision that Russia will regret later. A lot of people are split along the following lines. Those that think that Russia is intentionally holding back for some reason, and actually does have the capability to fight better, and those that think that the Russian military is old and busted and doesn't actually have the capabilities that they claim they do. Going back to a Cold War mentality that Russia's power comes from the perception of her power. In either case, if Russia is voluntarily or involuntarily not as effective as they should be, the effect is the same. They're not as effective as they should be. Whether they can't or they can but won't isn't super relevant to the 19-year-old BMP driver outside of Kiev, or to the civilian defending their home. I don't think that any one of these thoughts is the complete explanation for why Russia doesn't seem to be doing as well as we might have guessed they would, or why Russia seems to be making a lot of poor decisions. But maybe these random thoughts provide a different perspective or a different way of thinking about the Russian military in general. In any case, Russia is writing a lot of doctrine right now, and they are writing it the hard way, the same way the US wrote ours, by gaining experience. And maybe the biggest lesson that Russia has learned from this conflict is that Kiev is not Tbilisi, and Ukraine is not Georgia. Russia may start learning these lessons, and if they are fully committed to taking Kiev, they might just win this war, though win would be definitely too strong of a word. Whatever happens, this will not be a total victory for Russia. Russia's actions on the international stage have embarrassed herself, even taking aside the obvious Western propaganda and meaningless sanctions. Russia is supposed to be a superpower that should have taken Ukraine on the first day, much like the US and her overseas ambitions in the past. Expeditionary military operations to a country where the local populace doesn't want you there is a lot harder than it looks. On the civilian front, not too much to report other than the increasing tensions along evacuation routes to the west. Traffic is still atrociously bad, along with the rail transport to the west. Trains are still running as far as we know, and lots of people are cramming as many people as they can onto trains to get them to the west, out of these areas. But it's really hard to say when or where services might stop. Likewise, with traffic, there's really no good way to show people how to get around it because every road is jammed heading to the west. We aren't seeing too many problems or too many issues popping up, although tensions are really high along obviously the border zones. There have been a few fights breaking out here and there along the border at various immigration controls and things like that. So it's really hard to say exactly what's going on. I wouldn't say that it's complete and total pandemonium. No, it's not like an all-out panic, like a mad dash to the border. But there is tension there, and the tensions are increasing, and it's just not really a super pleasant time right now. So if we get any more information regarding the civilian front and how that's going to affect the civilian populace in the occupied territories, we'll let you know. Before we close today, I wanted to mention just a few thoughts because there's a lot of ideological thoughts out there these days, and it's really clear that a lot of the sources that are talking about Ukraine are talking about it in a certain way. And like I mentioned in the beginning, the situation for us has become a lot more complex and a lot more irritating when it comes to the information that is available to us about this war, the information that we can use to make decisions about our own lives. What I find myself doing really at this stage is just making observations and then taking steps to reduce my own personal vulnerabilities and increase my own capabilities. Those of you who have been listening to our stuff for a while, you know that we're all about that. We're all about reducing personal vulnerabilities and increasing capabilities, no matter what the situation is, right? So rather than get bogged down in the ideological fighting over what belief is better or what piece of information is better or worse, I find that it's a lot less stressful and a lot more productive to think about certain events and then the potential impacts. Like right now, the reason that we're even talking about Ukraine is that we generally don't think it's a super great idea for one nation to invade another, especially in Europe, especially for the reasons that Russia is claiming to have invaded for. But I also don't want to engage in situations that might increase the risk of going to war with another superpower. That internal conflict, that debate over what opinion to have is not very useful to kind of flesh out in my mind. Plus, I mean, the world is such a different place today. I mean, remember how for 2 years now we've had that magical C word on our minds? For the past 2 years, barely an hour has gone by without us thinking about the virus. For a lot of people, that became their identity. Nothing more important than that, however they felt about it. And now the same thing is happening right now with Ukraine. A lot of people do not go 5 minutes without talking about or consuming the Ukrainian war for political or social reasons. So we want to avoid that. And taking a step back, reassessing what's actually going on, and prioritizing what lessons to learn is sometimes necessary. This isn't going to be the last event like this, and we're looking into the future. Be it another invasion or some other worldwide polarizing event, we've got to get in the right mindset for the next decade. So that's all we've got for now. I just wanted to briefly touch on how keeping the right mindset is important moving forward. And as we move forward into this conflict, we have to remember that information is going to be few and far between. When the fighting for Kiev begins in earnest, there will be very little that we or anyone else can do. For us, our own goals are largely complete. We chronicled the lead up to the invasion and the initial invasion itself. Our goals were to help provide enough information for people to make the decision to stay or leave Ukraine, and what avenues of approach to take to do so. So in that regard, our work is mostly done. There seem to be very few people left in Ukraine that have not either made the decision to stay or go. What we will try to do moving forward is to provide our thoughts and lessons learned. So as our information about the situation on the ground becomes more and more ambiguous, we can still at least learn some lessons that will be helpful in making decisions in the future. So we're not going anywhere, but we also don't want to waste anyone's time if we don't have anything meaningful to add. So thanks again, everyone. Thank you for your support, and we will see you next time. And as always, fight in the shade.